Chapter 4 The Truth. Li Yi's words awakened Shinshiobai, who was surrounded by sadness, like a thunderbolt. Shinshiobai got up slowly and looked at Li Yi, who was standing at the door in disbelief. The noon sun fell from the sky and bathed Li Yi's surroundings. At this moment, Li Yi was shining like a god in Shinshiobai's eyes. Shinshiobai looked at Li Yi and said dully, "Is this a god? Have you ever thought about becoming a savior?" Li Yi asked again. "Can being a savior save my grandfather and the others?" Shinshiobai's eyes were full of hope, hoping that being a savior could save his grandfather who had raised him for 15 years, and all the villagers in Lingkong village. Li Yi shook his head mercilessly, breaking Shinshiobai's hopeful eyes. He slumped to the ground again weakly. I cried bitterly but couldn't make a sound. After a long silence, the sun in the sky also dropped a lot. Shinshiobai finally came back to his senses and asked, "Do you know all this, teacher?" Li nodded. "Can you tell me?" Shinshiobai asked. "Tell you, what else can you do?" Li Yi looked indifferent. "He is waiting for an answer." "Vengeance!" Shinshiobai roared, his fists clenched tightly, and the bones made a click sound. "Your enemies are so powerful that you can't imagine. Now you are like ants in front of them. Even me, I can't kill them completely without external force. Do you still choose revenge?" Li Yi asked calmly. "Either he died, or I died." Shinshiobai gritted his teeth and said, infinite anger rose in his heart. He didn't offend anyone, but his relatives were slaughtered. The villagers of Lingkong village did not offend anyone, but they were to be slaughtered in the village without leaving a living. Do you know why Lingkong village is called Lingkong village? Li Yi was very relieved when he heard the answer he wanted to get. Shinshiobai shook his head. Lingkong village once walked out of a strong man in the sky, and he is the only person on this planet who has reached the realm of the sky. The people in the village are proud of him. So it was renamed Lingkong village. Li Yi said. What does this have to do with the massacre of the villagers? Shinshiobai wondered, could it be because of a name? The person who went out from Lingkong village caused a big disaster in the universe. His enemies searched for his background, so they found Lingkong village. Li Yi continued. And then, so innocent people like my grandfather have to pay for his troubles? Shinshiobai's eyes widened. He couldn't believe that Lingkong village was slaughtered for this reason. Does the elephant care how many ants are killed with one foot? Li Yi finished, walked out of the house and looked at the sky. Seeing Li Yi walking out, Shinshiobai quickly got up and walked out. Do you know all these teachers? Shinshiobai asked. What if I know, what if I don't know? Li Yi turned to look at Shinshiobai. You know why you didn't tell me. You are so strong, why didn't you save them? Shinshiobai roared at Li Yi, which was also the first time he roared at his teacher in half a year to vent his dissatisfaction. What does their life and death have to do with me? Li Yi said coldly. But I'm your apprentice. Everyone who was killed is my relatives. Shinshiobai grabbed Li Yi's sleeve and roared. Every word he said seemed to have exhausted all his strength. Li Yi pushed Shinshiobai away, tidied up his sleeves, and yelled at him, if you are strong enough, then your relatives will not go to death alone without telling you. What you should blame is that you are not strong enough, even if you are not strong enough. You can't protect your own relatives, so what is your purpose of becoming a powerful warrior? Shinshiobai was stunned by this question. Yes, what is he determined to become a powerful warrior for? Is it bullying? Or to protect your loved ones? Or for something else? Shinshiobai was silent. He was a little confused for a while. Why did he cultivate? To become a powerful warrior is again. Li glanced at the silent Shinshiobai and thought to himself, it's almost time. Remember the question I asked you at the beginning? Have you ever thought about being the savior of the world? Li asked as soon as he saw that the time had come. Shinshiobai raised his head suddenly. Li Yi's words were like the finishing touch. His eyes lit up, and he looked at Li Yi with hope. What is the savior? Shin Xiaobai asked. The world is now in flames, there are wars everywhere, and people are struggling. The world is approaching the brink of collapse. We need a strong presence to end all this and start anew. Go back to the prosperous era 10,000 years ago. Li Yi couldn't help but fanatical get up and say excitedly. Teacher, are you saying that I'm here to be that powerful being? Shin Xiaobai pointed at himself, unable to believe it. He never thought he had that qualification, he didn't know how strong that mighty existence should be. But he knew that it was absolutely beyond his imagination, and it was impossible to achieve it unless the gods were against the sky. Li Yi nodded affirmatively. Teacher, I think I shouldn't do it, right? Shin Xiaobai stammered, he lacked confidence in himself. There are so many living beings and so many beings, how could the god-defying god be a 15-year-old country child? I trust his vision. Remember, you are the one chosen by the gods. You are qualified to be the savior of the world. Li Yi placed his right hand heavily on Shin Xiaobai's shoulder. He? Who is the teacher talking about? Shin Xiaobai asked. Who is Li Yi talking about? God? His vision? Why would the gods like a country boy from a low-level planet? You will see him in the future, you already know what you want to know. I got the answer I wanted. Now you should do what you should do. Li Yi pointed to Shin Chen's body lying on the ground in the house. Teacher, then who is my enemy? You haven't said it yet. Shin Xiaobai reminded him, without telling him who the murderer was. Didn't you see it before you entered the village? Li Yi asked back. Shin Xiaobai suddenly recalled that Li Yi killed a person at the entrance of the village. Thinking of the pattern embroidered on the mysterious man's chest, he also thought about the brief history of Qi Xuanqing that Shin Chen had given him earlier. The Zhang family, one of the 8 families of Qi Xuanqing. Shin Xiaobai shouted in alarm. Li Yi didn't speak, just pointed to Shin Chen's body quietly, reminding him. Seeing that Li Yi did not answer, Shin Xiaobai should have acquiesced. But he always felt that something was wrong, but at this moment he couldn't remember what was wrong. But he didn't have time to think about it at the moment, and he wanted to build a grave for his relatives. Let them be buried in peace. Shin Xiaobai wiped off the layer of frost that had already covered his face, and hurriedly ran towards the foot of the Sirius Mountains outside the village, where he was going to find an open space to bury his relatives. After Shin Xiaobai's body got better, the wind was blowing under his feet. But after a while, he arrived at the foot of the Sirius Mountains. And there he saw his teacher again. I've seen it here, it's a good place. No one will disturb them when they live here in the future. Li glanced at the open space in front of him that he had leveled. Shin Xiaobai's heart warmed when he heard this. Although his teacher was not good at words, he always expressed his love for his disciples in a way that he could see. Thank you, teacher. Shin Xiaobai bowed deeply to Li Yi. Oh. Li Yi smiled softly and turned to leave. Shin Xiaobai watched Li Yi leave, and immediately moved his hand. Shin Xiaobai used the strong spiritual power in his body to dig hundreds of big holes in this large open space. Then he ran back to Lingkong village, back to the courtyard full of blood. Shin Xiaobai walked slowly to Shin Chen and said, Grandpa, don't worry, I will definitely avenge this revenge. After speaking, he bent down and carried Shin Chen's body, and walked towards the place where the hole was dug. In order not to leave any new traces of the corpse, he deliberately walked slowly. While walking, I chat something about my childhood with Shin Chen. Grandpa, do you remember? When I was 6 years old, it was snowing heavily and my body was weak. But I was naughty and sneaked out to play, and my knee was a lot of red. I went home crying, but you didn't blame me. Instead, hurry up and get the medicine to help me deal with the wound. When I was 10 years old, I helped Uncle Li forge iron, and I accidentally burned a lot. It's you, in order to prevent me from leaving scars, you ran across the mountains to the city to invite a doctor. Shin Xiaobai was talking, but tears were left in the corners of his eyes. He used to be very naughty and made a lot of troubles. But it was his grandfather who helped him to stop him, and now he is alone. If he gets into trouble again in the future, no one will help him stop it. Shinshiobai arrived unknowingly, put down Shinchen with his own hands, and carefully put him into the big pit. The eyes are full of reluctance, but the world has long been separated. No amount of reluctance will eventually dissipate because of Shinchen's entry into the ground. Shinshiobai took one last look at Shinchen, and finally buried Shinchen. Running back towards the village again, tears were scattered all the way because of the constant bumps. Li Yi kept looking at Shinshiobai from a distance, and when he saw the young man shed tears, he couldn't help sighing. The only thing that suffers from such a huge plan is this child. Shinshiobai returned home again, carried his sister Shinyu on his back, and walked to the place where Xiaodong lived. Looking at the tender face lying in a pool of blood, his heart became painful again. But he didn't think much about it. He carried one in one hand and walked towards the big pit. In a back and forth cycle, the night fell in Shinshiobai's hundreds of trips back and forth. Until the moonlight really shines on the earth. Shinshiobai was finally busy with everything. There are 305 people in the whole village, and a lot of them all lie here. Shinshiobai placed a tombstone in front of each of his relatives, clearly writing their names and dates of birth and death. At the same time, each tombstone also had a sentence written, "I died for Shinshiobai." Shinshiobai thought that these relatives were willing to die for him. As for why they knew they would die but didn't leave early, he didn't know. Maybe it was to reassure the enemy and not cause other troubles to Shinshiobai. But no matter what, these relatives chose to hide Shinshiobai from him alone in order to prevent him from dying with them. This was all to allow Lingkong village to leave a trace of hope of revenge for them. Standing in front of the 305 tombstones, Shinshiobai knelt on his knees, kowtowed 3 times, and shouted loudly, "You are all my relatives, and I swear here today, if I don't take revenge, I, Shinshiobai, will not be human." Shinshiobai knelt down for a long time, leaning his head in front of his grandfather Shinchen's tombstone and crying softly. His grandfather will never help him out of trouble again. From now on he is alone. No matter what, he was still only a 15-year-old boy after all. After experiencing so many things in one day, there should always be a place to vent your emotions. At this time, Li Yi silently appeared behind Shinshiobai, reaching out with both hands to help him up. Shinshiobai stopped crying, and when he looked back, he saw Li Yi's soft smile. Looking at each other, Shinshiobai also gradually laughed. Who said he was alone? He still has this teacher. Would you like to go to the top of the Sirius Mountains? Li's gang, Shinshiobai, patted the snow on his knees. The top of the Tianlang Mountains? It is said that there are 5th-order monsters there. Teacher, can you solve it? Shinshiobai wiped the tears from the corners of his eyes. He knew that the teacher wanted to take him to improve his mood. Just say whether you want to go or not. Li Yi said. Of course I do. Shinshiobai nodded quickly, fearing that he would regret it. Li Yi smiled slightly and grabbed Shinshiobai's body violently. Immediately, Li Yi and Shinshiobai appeared on the top of the Heavenly Wolf mountain range. Wow, teacher, are you so powerful? Shinshiobai circled around the top of the mountain. The beautiful scenery around him couldn't help but exclaim, but what surprised Shinshiobai the most was his strength. Moving from the foot of the mountain to the top of the mountain in an instant, how strong is Li Yi? In addition to a clearing, the top of the Sirius Mountains is surrounded by very dense forests, towering into the clouds. The clouds are shrouded in mist, like a fairyland. Shinshiobai and Li Yi stood on the open space, admiring the dazzling stars in the night. Teacher, can you tell me what the world is like? Shinshiobai asked, suddenly looking at the sky.